Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay. So I wanted to put together a quick tyFLOW tutorial on doing skin tearing effects. And I thought this would be a fun introduction into the new tool, tyFLOW. It's been out for a little while now. I've been tinkering around on plane flights for a while with it, but unfortunately, I was speaking in IAMAG Masterclass in Paris 2 weeks ago. Then I was in Montreal and San Diego. Finally, I'm stateside. I'm able to sit down for a minute, and I wanted to put together this video just kind of showcasing a little bit of how it works, but more also gauging your interest if this is something that you want to see more on. I'd love to put out more tutorials on this, but again, I've got finite time and I wanted to see if this is something that I should put a little bit of my time into or focus on other things. So let me know what you think, and at the same time, if it is something you dig, make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. It'll mean the world to me, but also it'll be a good indication as to if this is something that you want me to kind of go down that narrow path of tackling more effects with it, because there's a lot we can do with it. Tyson, who put out the plugin, but also put out a lot of really cool videos around it. You can see it's very impressive what you can do. So let me know. Leave a comment. Let me know if this is something that you want to see more of. Either way, let's dive into the video. Okay, so I'm just going to dive right into this lesson. I'm going to do a quick crash course on tyFLOW, talk about a few things. This is going to be a very short lesson. It's more to scratching the surface a little bit. What I want to do is more gauge your interest if this is something that you want to learn more about. I have only finite time that I can put into anything, and I got to choose which bucket I put it into. So if you want me to elaborate more on tyFLOW specifically, leave a comment. Let me know that this is something that you actually want to see more of. And what I'll do is I'll start to put out more information, more training around this topic. But right now, I just want to kind of jump in for the minimal amount of time I can in between meetings to talk about this. So that being said, just let me know, leave a comment, let me know if this is something you want to see more of, and I'll definitely elaborate more and do more around this like I have in the past for particle flow, fume effects, real flow, and many of the other tools out there. Okay, so that being said, let's see, just to start out, I got this character here. What I'm going to do is I've got his face, and what I want to do is I'm just going to make this peel apart. I'm just going to jump into tyFLOW really quick. Couple of things. I won't go into how to install it too much or anything like that, but what I will say is just go to beta.tyflow.com, easiest way to get to it, and just go down to download, choose what one you want to download, as well as the sample scenes here. And what you'll have is a bunch of DLO, which is just standard Max plugin format to then throw into your plugin directory, and you should be good to go. There's a bunch of sample files, which are really good to start out, as well as a lot of documentation here as well. That's a good point to begin with, and from there you can kind of go further. Like I said, I'm happy to put out more training if you want to see more. Finally, I've got some free training, free courses, things like that. If you want to go to vfxcourse.com, you can download 8 free videos on creating a live action visual effects shot from scratch. So lots of cool stuff in there. Now, with this, let's just go to the create panel. You'll actually find tyFLOW lands in the primitives here. So you've got, box, sphere, whatever, tyFLOW. So I'm just going to initially drag this into the top viewport. So we just have the tyFLOW node created here. This is our particle systems. That's the only node that you need in the beginning. Now I'm going to go to the modify panel, and we can see all the general settings. I'm not going to get into this too much. Like I said, I've only got a little bit of time before I got to run to another meeting. So I'm just going to dive right into the interface. Now this is very similar to particle flow in terms of the layout and everything. You can create multiple tyFLOW nodes. They'll all be, they'll internalize everything inside of that one package or bucket. So in other words, you could have multiple tyFLOW nodes, and they won't share the same space like particle flow would, where it's more of a universal window. So to begin with, standard operators, birth, different types here. As we go through, we can see all that. What I want to do, I'm simply going to bring in a birth shape. Now, one way I like to do is just hit tab and do birth shape. Hit enter. And there we go. So we got our birth shape. I'm going to pick this head. And then I can hide the head for now. And let's just go to display. So we got our birth shape, which is going to bring in, like import the head model into the particle system. From there we have the display, which is going to display our one little particle. But what I want to do instead is go and display this as geometry. Now we can see we have the head. I'm not going to worry about the body. I'm just going to use that as a collision object. All I want to do is make this guy's face peel apart. And like I said, I can definitely go and elaborate more on this later, but for now I just want to do something fun. So that's the general thing, is like I've got this now imported as an object. And what I want to do is then set this up to break apart into different pieces. So diving as an initial course, it's kind of getting ahead of myself to dive right into cloth and things like that. But what I want to do is use every single vert as a particle bound to it. So I'm actually just going to go straight into, which is usually not what I'd want to do as a very first lesson, but I'm going to go straight into cloth, which again is right here. I'm going to be lazy about this though. I'm going to make sure you don't have any nodes selected. I'm just going to click the top event here so you can see that there. I'm just going to do cloth bind, hit enter, and it drops it in. If you were to do it with one of these selected, it'll actually replace it. I wish there was a key to kind of deselect things on the fly. I don't really like how it replaces stuff in general. I'd prefer just to hit delete and tab or whatever if I needed to. So anyway, cloth bind, as we can see, it's created all these individual points. So rather than before where we had one particle, very similar to thinking particles or Houdini, instead now it's distributing all these particles along the verts. And this is important because this way every single particle can actually deform the mesh. So one of the key things you'll notice about tyFLOW is that all of the forces are actually built into it. And I'd recommend using the built-in ones because they're internal, so they're faster. They're also multi-threaded. So in general, it's just going to be faster to work with them rather than your standard max forces. But I'm still kind of old school in terms of my habits. So I'm still going to use them from time to time. But I'm sure the more you use this, the more you'll get accustomed to just doing everything in here because there's a lot of really great controls. In general, though, I'm just going to hit force, and we're going to drop in a force. I'm going to, in general, again, I'm trying to do this really quickly, but I try and keep these in order, so force would be below here, so we do all the binding, and then all the advection, things like that would be at the bottom. But I might just kind of do this a little bit messier. But this is the force. We got a lot of standard options in here already. So this allows us to apply gravity, wind, turbulence, 2 levels of turbulence, which if you're familiar with what I do, I tend to have at least 2. So again, it just works really intuitively. So with this guy, already in just 3 nodes, we've created, like imported an object, distributed and bound particles to all the verts automatically. And there's a lot of controls in here, which we'll get into, but already we can see we have particles bound to it. And this model, by the way, is all tyFLOW. So in other words, we're selecting the model, it's all part of the internal system. The key thing is if we want to add wind, we already have in the x-axis. So if I wanted to see that, I need to look in the local, but where does x go? So x-axis, like x positive, is going to the right, which is exactly what we want. So already by default it has wind applied. And if we're to scroll through a little bit, we'd see the directionality isn't applied yet. So what we need to do is put in some strength. So this is our strength multiplier. Now the entire head is moving, and the reason for that is because everything is moving together. So another example would be to set that to 0, but we can introduce some turbulence. I'm just trying to throw in some random values. So it doesn't really matter too much. The main thing is that strength, and then frequency and scale are just going to control the patterns or the eddies that are happening. But already just in seconds, we're getting this deforming kind of thing. But you can see the way that this is being driven, like I'll change the scale here to like 0.1, the way this is all being driven is through these points. These particles are moving around. So if I were to display this instead as dots or whatever, and hide the head, the main thing is that the points are what's driving it around. So it's all rigged to that. So if you're familiar with like wrap deformers or skin wrap, same thing. Okay, so I'm just going to display as a large dots, that will do. But what I'll do is for now turn display dots off, and we can just look at the mesh itself. But the mesh is deforming, it looks kind of odd, but again, just through a couple of operators here, we're already getting a deforming surface. So I don't want this to deform right away. Like I said, I wouldn't typically be jumping right into using the cloth as like, here's how to use tyFLOW and let's start messing around with solvers. But in this case, I think it's kind of necessary for us to get all of those particle points to distribute on the surface here. Okay, but the thing is, I don't want this to happen right away. I don't want it to be distributing right away. So what I need to do is get my force. I'm just going to move it away and just dragging this out here creates a new event. And I can right click at the top here, choose motion or velocity, advection, whatever you want to call it. And we could just rename this one to static. Okay, so in other words, this here is our initial head and it's not doing anything. But then what we can do is have a trigger which causes it to begin to deform and break apart. So at this point, just going back to the front here, I'm going to create, let's say like something to cause it to break apart. So if I were to just create like a box here, again in the create panel, I just created a box, dragged it out. We can see in the top viewport here what we're getting. I'm just getting something to animate, and let's just get to like, I don't know, frame 70. I'm going to hit auto key and animate that moving across, and then I turn auto key off. So I did it kind of quick, but I'm hoping if you're doing this lesson that you know how to set 2 keyframes on something. To save a bit of time when it comes to solving, I'm going to move this closer so it's not sitting there sampling the entire time before it ever gets activated. So I made sure that's my first keyframe, and that's just going to move along. Now, one thing I'm going to point out is that by default, Max doesn't... the curve that it defaults to is more friendly for... sorry, I'm a bit jet lagged here. It's more friendly for character animation, things like that, more complicated animation. Now, for what we're doing, I still prefer to go to the more old school Bezier. So what I'm just going to do is select both of these curves, right click, and then change this tangent to the original one. And all I'm trying to do, I need to do on this end too, is set this where I'm just getting a linear curve, right? Rather than something that curves around too much. And it's just, in general, with effects, you're typically doing like 2 keyframes. You want it to be linear. You don't want it to be more of a bell curve. So I usually disable that in my preferences. I set it up as a regular straight curve, just so that way it's consistent rather than having an inconsistent animation. So that way I've just got a box wiping through. Now, again, I'm just going through this very quickly, but all we've done so far is we set up a tyFLOW node, and we created a birth shape. We didn't change anything. I just picked the head, and then I put a cloth bind on here, and default settings. All it did is it created points everywhere. It bound it all together automatically. And then we have a force here, which the settings right now aren't important. We're going to change them. It was just purely for demonstration. That's all we've done, and then we created this awesome box that is animating across the head. Now, the reason for this is because I want to use this to sample the particles, and anything that goes inside of this box, we're going to send to that other group. We're going to send it out to have motion. And the cool thing that, let's say, tyFLOW opposed to pFLOW is that everything up here gets carried down. So unless you break that connection, it's not like you need multiple solvers all the way through. You have a solver up here, and it's going to carry down here. So anything down here is still going to be cloth. Okay, so it's all considered inside of the same system. So with this box moving along, all I'm going to do is go in with nothing selected. I'm just going to do a surface test. Again, put this down the bottom so it tests it last. And this here gives me a lot of different options. All I want to do right now is I'm going to choose this object. I'm going to say test true if inside of that volume. Okay. Now, we're not going to see any difference, right? Because it's testing it, but it's not outputting anywhere. To make this really obvious, let's go display big dots. I'm going to hold shift, clone that as we did. And then I'm going to change the color here. Let's say that by default, they start out blue, okay? So go blue particles, as we can see. And then in here, we can instead sample green, okay? And that way we can tell that these are working. So I'm going to left click and drag on that little circle. Just like in tyFLOW, that's how we get that to connect. And now these are linked up. So what's going to happen is when these test true, in other words, inside of this volume, they're going to turn green. And we can already see that these guys are turning green. So a couple of little things I want to change. I created a big volume. Let's be a little bit more practical in height. I don't care about the neck. I'm just going straight for the head. Kind of like Thor should have. So, it's this guy. So, just going to moving through for now. We can adjust it later because obviously it's not touching the jaw. But as we can see, this is now moving these particles along, and they go in here, they turn green. And just for the sake of visualizing this better, I'm going to right click on the object. We'll go object properties. I'm going to turn renderable off and display as box. And that way we can see this box as is. And as it comes through, it's now animating the green. Now the green's messing around, but is pulling the blue particles. So we could make these instead not active, for instance, or static, whatever we wanted to do. For now, I'm just going to say we do like a particle switch and have these deactivated. I'm going to hold and make sure I'm not, make sure this is green. I like that that's green. That's a nice touch. Just to duplicate that, but say activates. And now when these come into the new group, it means they're going to activate. So that's one thing to consider, is just so that way we can tell these particles not to move. So I'm just going to pull this underneath the cloth binding, which is important. And what we'll notice now that the activation, or deactivation I should say, is happening after the cloth bind, we'll see that the particles below don't move anymore. So I wanted to make that really clear that the order of everything is extremely important, because it's going to sample the birth, and then this, and then that. And for instance, if it was testing something above, the binding and everything else, it's not going to recognize a lot of the sequencing that happens beneath it. So that's really important. So that way, the deactivation happens after the binding. Otherwise, there's one particle being sampled, right? So it's just important to have that. Now, again, we're going through this really quickly, but already we've now got the head deforming based on the fact that this object is passing through it. So it's extremely simple, but it makes for some pretty interesting animation. Now, I want to go further with this, and instead of just having turbulence, let's turn the turbulence off, and let's turn back on the wind. So I just went to my force, disable turbulence by turn on wind, and now we're going to get this, which I knew was going to look a bit silly. We also have gravity, stuff like that, which we'll mess with in a minute. The key thing is that now we have this where the head is being pulled apart. What I want to do is I'm going to go back to my cloth binding. We can actually tell this to break apart if it stretches too much. So you can go down to tearing. And because this is real time, like the head isn't too complicated, it should be pretty much like we can just adjust it in real time. So here we can change, like I just enabled cloth tearing. You might need to expand that rollout, but we have enable cloth tearing, and you can choose like how much it's going to stretch, right? So I kind of didn't mind what we had. 150 seems fine. I am going to disable the dots for now, so we just see the mesh itself. I'm also going to change this to clay just here. So it's just a little bit prettier to work with. Same deal, I'm going to disable the display dots. And that way we're just seeing this happen in real time. Okay, so this is just a starting point to work with. I'm going to do a few other things. I'm going to add in a slow. Now slow is essentially drag, but, and again, order is everything. It's not too important here, but again, it's just better to be organized. The cool thing is that slow will also apply to spin as well. So that way, let's say if something's slowed down, then the spin could slow down too. It doesn't need to be, just the velocity by itself. So I think that's just important to get like a little bit more of a different animation to it. In addition to that, we can have the wind. I'm going to enable a little bit of turbulence. These values are very sensitive, okay, so just keep that in mind. The other thing, I'm just going to apologize, I am jumping around a little bit, but if I go to customize unit setup, I just want to talk about this for a second. This is my unit setup. I work in generic units because setting my turbulence to 0.5 feet, it doesn't really mean anything. So when I go customize units, I'm just mentioning this because in my mentorship, one of the things that people can kind of misunderstand is the units here. So this is just purely for display. It doesn't mean anything, okay? System units, okay, so this button up here, this is everything. Okay, so I've only worked at one studio in my life that used anything other than metrics, or metric I should say, sorry, so metric system. So in general, we'll typically work in centimeters. Some places will work in meters, but typically centimeters. Inches, even in the States, is very rare. So, again, I'm in centimeters. This is what we're typically working with. And if we look at this cube, 24, 6, 18, this should give you a good idea about the scale that we're working with, just to give you an idea, okay? So his head's about 30 centimeters tall. So I just want to mention that so you just got some reference of scale. But right now we got the head pulling apart. It's kind of boring, but again, simple setup, and we're already getting really cool results. So I think that's just so important with what we're doing, to just get something where this is already pulling apart. Now, what I could do is set up the strength to be less, set up the turbulence to be a little bit more. I can set up a second turbulence. So for instance, I might make this more high frequency but lower in strength. So I won't go into turbulence right now, but again, if you find this intriguing and you want to see more on this, I'm happy to drop as much knowledge as I know about particles and effects and tyFLOW from the bit of time I've spent with it. But again, it's so intuitive and it's accurate to every other system out there that it's easy to pick up in seconds. So if you want me to explain turbulence more, I'm happy to, but this is the strength. Turbulence and scale work together. One's the frequency, well, that's why it's called frequency, and scale. So again, it's just the repetition, how quickly that happens. So the two of them together, you're going to get some interesting patterns as this breaks apart. I might set that to let's say 2.1. I'm just messing around enough to kind of get this to want to tear apart a little bit easier. So, we're getting something interesting from this. But from here, let's start to get a lot more control from it. So for instance, how quickly does this break apart? I think getting it to stretch a little bit, the resistance, means that we'll get more interesting shapes. But right now, it kind of does pull apart with very easily. It doesn't have much resistance. So there's a few things that we can do here. One of the key things would be that with the cloth bind, we could play with the mass. And it's good when you're getting familiar with this stuff just to be aware of, using it in real time. Like if I can get real-time feedback, it's going to allow me to learn much quicker. So mass means that whether it's just going to instantly get pulled away or whether there's going to be some resistance, the stronger it is, the kind of heavier or more resistant it will be. Stretch, we could lower the stretch, which means it's not going to pull apart as much. But then we have volume. Volume's kind of interesting. It won't be too applicable here, but this essentially is going to give it a bit of life inside of it. The other thing is right now these are, sorry, I'm jumping ahead because I want to explain this, but life being that if this is volume, it's going to try and prevent it from collapsing down on itself. So if we were to scroll down a little bit, we do have some controls in here for shelling this out and creating a closed surface inside of it. So I can go down and say add shell to surface, and you can notice that this becomes 3D. So we don't want this to be too thick. I'm just going to say I'm going to say 0, and I'm going to put this to 0.05. I'm going to make this extremely thin, but then we could just up here add a little bit of volume, which is going to force it to keep itself a little bit. I'm going to try 0.1. I'm also going to turn on constrained, which is just going to be, how do I put this? It's going to sample it a little bit more, which will make it a little bit slower potentially, but it will give it more of an interesting pattern. So all I've done so far is I added the shell down here to make it have a bit more depth. I added the volume to kind of prevent it from collapsing down on itself. And we can control the stretch, things like that, which are going to control more the overall shape. So we can say stretch a lot, but we also have that threshold of how much stretchiness happens before it breaks. The other thing too, right now I've got this shape, which is very constant. So the next thing we're going to try and introduce is just getting this not to just pull it all apart, but instead pull bits of it apart. But already this is kind of interesting, just getting the entire thing to break apart like it is. So the other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to get my shear, I'm going to bring that down a little bit, and that's just going to help encourage it to rip apart a bit more. The nose is going to look a bit weird because the box doesn't touch that, so let's just move this forward a little bit so it covers more of the front than it does the back. So as we can see, the face is ripping apart now and beginning to blow away. So what I can encourage, I'm just going to do this really quick, I'm going to move this across more, is going to the force. Just for a second, let's lower this to 0, but let's add gravity, and it actually should be negative, I think. So I just added 0.1 gravity. Now the face is just falling off, which is kind of cool, right? So we got that where now the face just kind of peels away. And another thing about tyFLOW is that assuming it's not going to hit any memory caps, which are in the options, I can just hit end, like at the very end here, and now it's cached all in memory, so I can actually scrub very easily. So we're going to get the entire thing just to collapse down. So rather than using wind, we can just have the entire thing kind of just fall apart, and we get some kind of interesting effects from that. Now, like I said, going back to the cloth bind, we can actually give this a lot more depth. I could go into here and make this 0.15 for the thickness, and that's going to make it shell out a lot more. So that's just kind of interesting because it's going to give us a bit more of a nice result from it all collapsing down. So the other thing I want to do is I want to actually use the body here as a collision object, and I want to set the friction quite high for that. So again, nothing selected, I'm going to hit tab, do a collision. I'd love if when you tabbed and created things, it would drop them to the bottom. That's my other thing I kind of would prefer, because typically they're not going to be something you want at the top. We can just do front faces for now. I think that'll be fine. I'm going to pick the body. I think I got it frozen, so there we go. Pick the body. And I'm not going to, like I said, I want to go through just what counts this time around, but I'd be happy to elaborate more on the settings, because some of this stuff, especially collision radius, can be really important. For now, I'm not going to get into that though, but what I will get into is set the bounce low, we'll set the friction rather high, threshold is basically the distance, but I'm just going to set the 0.1 for now. Again, I'd love to elaborate more on some of this stuff, like collision offset actually for distance, but I'd love to elaborate more on that at another time. For now, I just want to kind of get into this, but now what we can see is we've got all of this spilling down onto the body, which is kind of neat. Just going to change this to clay. Let's just pick a more interesting angle now we're kind of getting into it all. But the whole point is that all of this now is kind of spilling out onto the body. It's got gravity, and it just looks a lot more interesting. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the play button. Let's just set this to 150, just make the frame length a little bit longer. I'm just jumping to the last frame, so that way it caches all this out, we can see, and then I can scrub through and we can see the whole face peeling apart. And most of that's getting caught on his bib, on his shirt. So, that just gives us something interesting. Now, like I said, I just want to plow through this really, really quick, but hopefully that makes sense. Like, you know, we're able to get a system that's able to spill out pretty intuitively, and everything seems to work really well, just to kind of give us something interesting. And again, like something like this, you know, other systems, you know, is very achievable, but it's so much more work. And that's what I'm really impressed with is the speed to do this. You know, for instance, Avengers Endgame coming out April 26th, like when I created the big poster for that, I did all that in Thinking Particles, and I did the whole thing for the movie poster in about 3.5 days. But calculation-wise, like, you know, I'd have to go away for 30 minutes, get a coffee across the street, come on back over, and my sim would be done. Whereas here, you can see how quickly we're able to literally sim it in 8 seconds, and then from there, scrub through. So this is extremely intuitive for what we need. And again, like, this is just tip of the iceberg, but I just wanted to put out something really quick just to kind of point out what you can do with it. And of course, from here, you know, you could definitely push this a lot further. I just wanted to do something really basic. Just again, like, I want to know if this is something that you're interested in. If so, then, you know, I'm happy to put out a lot more high-end training around it. Obviously, you've probably seen a lot of the training that I do, which, you know, is focused on creating finished visual effect shots. I don't really do just crappy tutorials that cover a feature and then, you know, move on. I want to show you how it works in production. I just got off the phone with one of the effects TDs at Scanline VFX who was in my mentorship, and knowing that he just gone through the mentorship and walked right into the studio and was able to start knocking out shots, that's because we're going through and creating finished shots. We're going through the entire workflow. So again, for me, that's really important, but I want to know if this is something that you want to see before I get into that. But like I said, the whole point is that we've got controls with this. So as you're going through, you've got that real-time feedback that you can choose what specifically is going to get broken. I'm moving the box, and in real time almost, I'm able to choose like what is actually breaking apart. I can choose in the cloth binding here how much it's going to stretch before it rips apart. So you have the entire face beginning to melt away, or whatever you want it to be. So there's a lot in here that I want to elaborate on, but for now, I just want to get this out, see if this is something that you want to see. So again, leave a comment, let me know, and I'll be sure to follow up with really more high-intense training. I've got a whole team of VFX artists that work for me, so I'm happy to put together some real visual effect shots and showcase all of this. Cool. So that being said, if you found this interesting, leave a comment, let me know what you think. On top of that, make sure to go to vfxcourse.com. I've got a 8-video free live action class which goes through creating entire visual effects destruction shots, destroying some of downtown LA, taking the shots from start to finish, which I think would be really beneficial. All of that's free. Check it out if you want as well. So vfxcourse.com, and that should be like a good follow-up for this as well. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching. Again, let me know, is this something that you want to see more of? Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said, let me know if this is something that you want to see more of. I got to run to a meeting right now, but I wanted to quickly put this out. But I also want to gauge whether or not this is something that you want to see more training around. I'd love to do some building destructions, creature effects, so many different things that we could do. So leave a comment, like it. If you can subscribe to my channel, that'd be a good indicator as well. But again, I'd be very grateful, and this is your way to be able to get indication about when new training is coming out. So I'll leave it there. Thanks again for watching. I appreciate you, and I appreciate your time to go through and watch this training with me. And I gotta run, but again, let me know if this is something that you want to see more on. Okay, so I'll be back with another video later this week. Again, thanks for watching. get the free visual effects class. This is a free 18-hour class on live action visual effects, covering destruction, fire and explosions, lighting, rendering, all within a real visual effects pipeline. Sign up now, it's free at vfxcourse.com.